The 12 disciples gathered with Jesus to observe the Passover. At this meal, Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper. Also on this occasion, Jesus said that one of the 12 would betray him. This announcement saddened the apostles. Mark writes, "One by one they said to him, 'Surely you don't mean me.' One of them knew. Mark's readers also know. He has already identified Judas as the betrayer. Tommy South writes, "In the closing hours of Jesus' life, Judas was not the only one who failed Jesus. All of his disciples failed him, in spite of his warnings and attempts to prepare them for what was about to happen." Our text this morning is Mark chapter 14, beginning with verse 26. Mark chapter 14, beginning with verse 26. When they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. "You will all fall away," Jesus told them, "for it is written, 'I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered.' But after I have risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee." Peter declared, "Even if all fall away, I will not." "I tell you the truth," Jesus answered. "Today, yes, tonight, before the rooster crows twice, you yourself will disown me 3 times. But Peter insisted emphatically, "Even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you." And all the others said the same. They went up to a place called Gethsemane. And Jesus said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." He took Peter, James, and John along with him, and he began to be deeply distressed and troubled. "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death," he said to them. "Stay here and keep watch." Going a little farther, he fell to the ground and prayed that if possible the hour might pass from him. "Abba, Father," he said, "everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will." Then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. "Simon," he said to Peter, "are you asleep? Could you not keep watch for 1 hour? Watch and pray, so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the body is weak." Once more he went away and prayed the same thing. When he came back, he again found them sleeping. Because their eyes were heavy, they did not know what to say to him. Returning the 3rd time, he said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? Enough, the hour has come. Look, the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer." As we look at our text, we see first a prediction of failure. After singing a hymn, the scene changes from the upper room to the Mount of Olives. Judas is no longer with them. Jesus tells the 11 that they will all fall away. He says they will all fall away, each and every one of them. He quotes from Zechariah chapter 13, verse 7. "I will strike the shepherd," that would be Jesus, "and the sheep will be scattered." But he follows the bad news by some good news. He says, "But after I have risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee." Jesus says, "You're going to fall away from me, but that's not going to be a permanent thing, because I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to see you again in Galilee." Well, immediately there is a protest of the failure, verses 29 through 31. Peter states strongly that he will not fall away. He says, even if all fall away, he will not. Jesus replies to Peter with a more specific prophecy. He says that very night before the rooster crows the next morning, Peter will disown Jesus 3 times. Here in Mart, occasionally you can hear a rooster crow, kind of a part of a small town. Jerusalem was a city, but there were apparently roosters all over the place. Basically, Jesus is saying, Peter, before very many hours pass, before the sun comes up, before the rooster crows, you will disown me. You will deny me, not once, but 3 times. Only Mark has the detail that the rooster crows twice. The others just said the rooster crows. Peter tells Jesus that Even if he has to die with Jesus, he will never disown him. He says, I'll go to the death with you if I have to. Well, the other apostles say the same thing. Luke chapter 22, verses 31 through 34, gives some additional words that Jesus spoke to Peter. Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift all of you as wheat. But I have prayed for you, Simon, that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. But he replied, Lord, I am ready to go with you to prison and to death. Jesus answered, I tell you, Peter, before the rooster crows today, you will deny 3 times that you know me. Martel Pace, in commenting on these verses, said, the Apostle Peter was not only too confident in himself, he was also scornful of others' weaknesses. In arrogance, he compounded his failure. He had a true love for Jesus, but he was too self-reliant. He was ignorant of his real inner self and of the struggles he would encounter. If he could have faced them his way with sword in hand, he might have fought to the death, but that was not Jesus' intention. Peter says, these other guys, now they may fail, but I won't. Too much confidence in himself and not enough trust in the Lord. Alan Black said, that very evening, Peter would encounter one of the great trials of his life. Then we have a prelude to failure, verses 32 through 42. In fact, we might call it the first failure. They now go to Gethsemane. It's called sometimes the Garden of Gethsemane. More likely, it was an orchard, a place where there were many olive trees. In fact, the name Gethsemane means the place of oil presses. From Gethsemane, there would be a view across the way to the temple and to the city of Jerusalem. But this was a quiet, secluded place. In Jesus' day, the slopes of the Mount of Olives were filled with olive groves. During the war of AD 66 to 70, the Romans cut down huge numbers of the trees to build their siege works. We notice that as they enter Gethsemane, that Jesus selects Peter, James, and John to go with him farther into Gethsemane. They alone would be with him. And these 3 had been with Jesus on some other special occasions. They were witnesses to the raising of Jairus' daughter, and they were present at his transfiguration. At Gethsemane, they have a closer view of Jesus' agony and suffering. David Garland writes, Jesus separates Peter, James, and John from the rest of the group to go with him as he prays. Peter had just boasted that he would stand firm with Jesus through his trials, even if they led to death. James and John promised that they could be baptized with his baptism and could drink his cup, chapter 10, verse 39. Jesus gives them a chance to back up their words. Mark tells us that Jesus was deeply distressed and troubled. He says, my soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Jesus is the Son of God, fully God. But Jesus on this earth was fully man. He experienced every fear, every emotion that a human being could experience as he faced his death. He was sorrowed to the point of death. Jesus instructs the 3, Peter, James, and John, to watch, to keep watch. Jesus goes a little farther into the garden. Luke says about a stone's throw. This is the 3rd occasion that Mark speaks of Jesus praying, and is the most important of the 3. Jesus falls to the ground. Now, the normal posture for prayer in those days was standing, looking up to the sky with your hands raised. But falling on the ground was a posture sometimes used. It would indicate great distress, and that is what Jesus had. Jesus prayed then, if possible, the hour might pass from him, also to take this cup from me. The cup was that of suffering, in other words, his death. The hour would be the hour, the time that he would encounter his suffering. He prayed, if possible, if there is another way, Lord, let's do it that way. Jesus acknowledges that everything is possible with God. And he says, yet not what I will, but what you will. Jesus is willing to obey his Father, yes, even to the point of death. Jesus returns to the three. They were not watching, they were sleeping. We can probably sympathize with Peter, James, and John. It's late at night. I've been known to start a television show, and I will fall asleep for at least the last 5 minutes of it. That's very frustrating. But Jesus has a far greater situation. He's asked these three men, his three closest disciples, to watch with him. In other words, to pray. Instead, their eyes get heavy, they sleep. It's not enough that he wakes them up the first time or the second time, they go back to sleep. Earl McMillan says, the incident recorded here clearly depicts the two vastly different levels on which various members of the group at this point were thinking. Jesus was under the severe stress of his impending fate, while his disciples, content for the most part to be with their master, were largely oblivious to what was happening around them. Jesus' need for prayer must be taken seriously. It shows the humanness of the situation, as well as his dependence upon the Father. Wendell Willis wrote, Jesus returned to the three disciples, finding them sleeping. Those who only a few hours earlier had said they would give their lives for Jesus' sake did not stay awake as he suffered his greatest agony. Jesus asked them a third time, are you still sleeping and resting? This is a criticism and not an inquiry. They should have been praying. In verses 37 and 38 in particular, we notice a preventative to failure. Jesus says you're all going to fail, but he also gives them a means to avoid failure. Peter and the other disciples needed to pray. He told them to pray that they might avoid the failure. He said the spirit is willing, but the body is weak. While Jesus prayed, the disciples slept. We notice here that Jesus addresses Peter as Simon. The name Peter meant rock. Could it be that Peter wasn't being a rock at this moment? But Jesus says, watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. Again, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. The disciples would soon face a trial. Their own strength would be insufficient. They needed to pray for strength. Instead, they slept. Well, after Jesus prays for some time, he comes the last time to Peter, James, and John. The time for praying or sleeping is over. He says the hour has come. His betrayer is at hand. Alan Black observed, in Mark's account, the focus seems to fall on the contrast between how Jesus faced the impending crisis of his life in submissive prayer versus the disciples' failure to prepare. In terms of Mark's focus on Christology, the Gethsemane scene portrays Jesus as overwhelmed with sorrow at the prospects of the cross, and yet unflinchingly submissive to the Father's. In terms of the focus on discipleship, it calls on the reader to watch and pray, as did Jesus, and not to follow the example of the disciples. Yes, the disciples will all fail Jesus. All but one will overcome their failure. we can pray and ask God for forgiveness, and He will forgive. It would be better to pray that we could overcome the temptation to sin, that we could avoid failure. We should pray all the time. When we face trials, we should pray even more. Tommy South writes, discipleship failure is a possibility for all of us. Peter, James, John, and all the rest. If so, certainly so for you and me. Stay close to Jesus. Seek God in prayer. The only way to succeed in following Him. Shall we stand and sing?